All right. Good, good, good. Hey, Max, how are you? Hey, Max. All set on your end? Are we? And Max, what about callers? Can I get access to list of callers if they call in?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes. This is Jim.
Yeah, so this is Max.
Okay.
Do you do you have the chat open on StreamYard?
I do not know.
So over are you on the StreamYard tab right
I
now?
am. Yep. Yep.
So over on the right side you should see a couple of buttons. There's one that says comments, banners, media assets, style, and people.
Yep.
If you click on the one that says people,
Okay.
I will be so just I'll put if there's any callers, I'll put their name in there.
Okay. Great.
Because you
Good.
won't, I don't think you're, because they're not technically calling the same studio as you, so there's not a way for you to see the same ones I do from
Right.
there.
Right.
If
Okay.
somebody calls, I'll just put,
Good.
their name and stuff
Terrific.
in that chat right there.
Good. And but it says I can still give them your number, which is 855-752-4842. That remains the same. Yes.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah. So I'll
Great.
take them here
Excellent. I can hear you just fine. I hope you can hear me, and this will work. Miracles of maybe not no longer miracles of technology, but thanks for doing this, and
Yeah.
everything else remains the same, right? We're just um, 80 miles apart, right? Something like
Yup,
that.
yup. And if you, I mean, like, you'll be able to, if I'm not able to talk, if we're not on the air, um, but if there's anything you need while you're on the air, you'll be able to hear me.
Sure,
You just
that sounds
you
good.
can't hear me unless we're like on the
That
air.
sounds great. Good, good.
So,
All right, we're set to go in a couple minutes here, right? Very good.
yeah, sounds good. We got just under 2 minutes, so you probably just see the Civic Media banner right now. I'll unhide that, and then you should hear the music.
Wonderful. And you'll still do the hand signals for me and music coming up and all that kind of good stuff. Great, great.
For sure.
Terrific.
All right, we got about a minute and a half here, so make sure that everything's set up. That one. All right, we should be good to go.
All right.
I'll probably hang up the phone call here.
Sure.
About 30
Okay, good,
seconds, so.
good.
Is there any other questions?
I think I'm all set. Good. I think we're okay. Yep, yep, good. All righty. Ready to roll here.
Hang up the phone call. We got just under a minute here, so
Terrific.
hopefully nothing explodes.
Wonderful. Good. Thanks, Max.
Welcome to Amicus, a law review with Jim Santelle, Civic Media's weekly review and discussion of some of the most significant news stories in the areas of law, government, courts, and the aspiration for justice. And now, here's your host, Jim Santelle.
This is Amicus, a law review, and yes, my name is Jim Santelle. I'm your host on this broadcast. This weekend, our weekly review of all things government, rule of law, and aspiration for justice related. Thank you so much for joining me here on the broadcast stations of Civic Media. This weekend, I am coming to you live Saturday and repeated on Sunday. Live right now, just in the wake of the recent events in Washington, D.C., which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, specifically the Department of Justice, but also coming to you from another capital, that is our state capital here in Madison, just in the shadow of our wonderful dome here right off of State Street in the studios of Civic Media. My terrific producer, Max, is in Racine and handling all of the administrative and technological aspects of our program. And because of that, Max and I are once again able to take your phone calls, your questions, your inquiries. That number is 855-752-4842. One more time, that's 855-752-4842. You can be a part of our discussion here on Amicus, a law review, bringing in your questions and your inquiries, your observations and your comments. I suspect, as always, there will be a lot of them in this weekend broadcast. Once again, appreciate your time, your devotion of your interest and resources to our conversation this weekend when a lot of things are on our agenda. Let me tell you a little bit about what is on our syllabus for this, our weekend show, beginning with what has turned into the second component, the second portion of our version of all things DOJ, all things the Department of Justice. You may recall that last week in our broadcast, we began to talk about some of the major changes that are being made under our newly invested Attorney General, her name Pamela Bondi, and also someone who is at the Department of Justice running the show, running the operation from virtually the time that Donald Trump took office. His name is Emile Beauvais. We're going to be hearing a lot about him today, this weekend, and we'll be talking a lot about him, I suspect, in the days and weeks, months, maybe even years ahead, because he has been making a lot of news just this past week, as has Pam Bondi. And so we're going to be continuing what we started last weekend, which is all things DOJ, major news items coming out of Main Justice. It's there at 9th Street and Constitution Avenue, right there in between the White House and the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. Yes, necessarily, we're going to be talking about Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, and this major story that has continued legs from several weeks ago when we first began to report on this notion that maybe, just maybe, there were some discussions underway between the Department of Justice and Eric Adams about dismissing that major federal prosecution, a criminal prosecution brought against him by a grand jury in New York. Well, it turns out that there's not a complete resolution of that, but certainly a lot of movement in that case. We're going to spend a lot of time talking in our first hour about Eric Adams, the charges against him, remind you of those. We'll talk about exactly what's been going on between the White House and the Department of Justice. Yes, Emile Beauvais, who is the acting Deputy Attorney General, the number 2 in control, in command of the Department of Justice, directing just this past week the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. She's a U.S. attorney there, appointed on an interim basis by this president to serve until a Senate-confirmed U.S. attorney takes that position. She decided this past week not to follow the directives of her superiors in Washington, D.C. In particular, wrote a letter, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, and frankly, even providing you with specific information about the content of that letter. It is both chilling and it's also a fantastic articulation of all things civic, of what the rule of law is supposed to be and what prosecutors should and should not be all about. She is schooling her boss, Emile Beauvais, the acting Deputy Attorney General. She's arguably schooling the Attorney General herself. The Attorney General now in office for about 10 days or so. We'll talk about that and the resignations. The resignations now up to seven major top prosecutors in New York, in Washington, D.C. We'll talk about the reasons for their decisions to abandon, to leave the Department of Justice rather than doing the things that they've been directed to do, these things that they feel rightly are contrary to the basic operational structure, the basic missions, the purposes of the Department of Justice. We'll tell you more about all of those. And then we'll talk about what's going to happen next, which is the petition, which, yes, indeed, finally was signed. Late Friday, we'll tell you about who actually affixed their name to that pleading, how that happened, and what the message is even there at the time of the filing of this motion to dismiss the criminal prosecution against Eric Adams, and then what a federal district court judge is going to be doing in the future. Lots of things to unpack in connection with that major story coming out of the Department of Justice, which once again, regrettably gives us another opportunity to talk about civics in America and schooling all of us on what should and should be the United States Department of Justice just these first days, these first weeks of the Trump administration. A few of the things also on our agenda this weekend. We're going to talk about other matters coming out of the Department of Justice, some other dismissals that have sort of flown under the radar. Those 2 remaining defendants in that Mar-a-Lago documents case, you may recall that they were also charged along with the now president, at that time former president, with violating all sorts of rules with respect to documents, national security matters, classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. Those 2 remaining co-conspirators when it comes to obstruction of justice and the charges against them for doing just that in connection with that prosecution. Those two have been dismissed. We'll talk about that, give you some information about what that means, why that's important as well. And then we're also going to talk about another piece of litigation, not criminal in nature, but announced by the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, just this past week. She has announced that she is suing both the governor of New York State and also the Attorney General of the United States, of New York, coming out of the Department of Justice. What's the basis for that? Premised upon the allegation that they have failed to provide support and assistance and engagement on immigration issues there in New York. We'll talk about what Pam Bondi announced from the Department of Justice across state lines into New York just this past week as well. And finally, sort of a footnote to all of that, and not a specific federal case, but one that comes in the wake of a federal case. It was previously dismissed, previously gotten rid of. This one involves Steve Bannon, the former senior advisor to the current president. You may recall that he was initially charged by the federal government, by the United States Department of Justice, for violations of federal law when it comes to fraud and corruption in relation to his Build the Wall campaign. And although the trial there was going to be conducted by a federal district court judge, Donald Trump pardoned the defendant there, Steve Bannon, and resulted basically in the dismissal of that case. Well, it turns out that the state of New York and Alvin Bragg, the DA there in Manhattan, decided to pick up that prosecution, charged Steve Bannon with the same kinds of things, but under state law in violation of New York law. And we'll talk about the dismissal of that case, the resolution of that case, basically, upon the plea of guilty by Steve Bannon, and what the judge did, the resolution of that case in New York, coming out once again of a state court, but in the wake of a federal prosecution. Necessarily a major portion of our continuing focus on all things DOJ is going to be on the major policy changes, practices, and memorandums issued by the Attorney General in the brief 10-day period since she has been our chief federal law enforcement officer. She has issued something approaching 20 different memorandums, some of them fairly routine but important, others of them changing dramatically the ways in which the United States Department of Justice, the ways in which United States attorneys, 92, 93 of them around the country, are going to be prosecuting cases on your behalf in the coming years. We'll talk about those policies, and specifically at the outset, which leads us back into Eric Adams, we're going to talk about this major change adopted by the White House, and yes, indeed, by this Department of Justice. It says that arm's length relationship that we have talked about so much on this broadcast, so much of that is no longer in place. And what that means is that now a huge amount of communication going on between the White House and Main Justice about what? About specific cases that are pending, including, plainly, the Eric Adams matter. All of that as a part of our continuing focus on the policies, the practices, the things that Pam Bondi is already doing to change the Department of Justice. She's got some major issues on her hand right now when it comes to dealing with this Eric Adams matter. But the reality is that all of these things are going to be affecting all of us, because the Department of Justice, again, subject to the directions and the instructions of the Attorney General, of the Deputy Attorney General, who is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the agency. All of that has a direct impact upon the United States Department of Justice, and once again, U.S. attorneys in every state in the union, including right here in Wisconsin, including in the Eastern District of Wisconsin and also in the Western District of Wisconsin. We plainly will also be looking in future broadcasts to that process as well. As you know, as we have discussed, the process for putting new United States attorneys in place is a political one. It shouldn't be, because the office is not political, shouldn't be at least apartisan. But nonetheless, because of the way that history has played out here in America, it is a position, all these positions, subject to nomination by the president and then confirmation, advice and consent by the United States Senate. And so soon The president is going to be nominating two individuals, presumably two lawyers, to serve as the chief federal law enforcement officers right here in Madison, where I'm broadcasting from this weekend, and also in Milwaukee, my home base, and all other U.S. attorneys' offices from around the country. That's coming up, and we'll take a look at the process by which that happens, involving traditionally and presumably again this time with our two senators, our senior senator, our junior senator. You know their names, Ron Johnson, obviously at the top of that list as well. He has a lot to say when it comes to making those decisions. The other one, of course, is Tammy Baldwin, our junior senator, and together they make a recommendation to the White House about those nominations. All of this following our further discussion here on Amicus, a law review. My name is Jim Santelle, and this is Amicus, a law review. We are coming to you today from the studios here in Madison, Wisconsin, but broadcasting throughout the stations, throughout Wisconsin and in other places, always taking your phone calls, your inquiries, your comments at 855-752-4842. And beginning, of course, our discussion in this, our weekend broadcast, with this major story coming out of both New York City and also Washington, D.C., focusing upon the present, the current, the continuing mayor. His name is Eric Adams, as you know well. He is facing election in the months just ahead, which also animates in major ways what should be a non-political story, but nonetheless has become very partisan-related, very politically animated by all of the things going on in New York and in Washington, D.C. as well. Let's go back and provide you with a little bit of background about how we got to this spot and then give you some sense about what's going to happen in the future. You may recall that way back in late January, just a few weeks ago, we did some initial reporting on this right here on this broadcast, indicating that the Justice Department at that time, some reporting was said to be discussing dropping the case against Eric Adams, that case which I'll tell you more about in just a few moments. Recent weeks at that time, Eric Adams, who was known to be a Democrat, had created a fair amount of favor with Donald Trump. He met with the president-elect at that time, even before these reports surfaced at Mar-a-Lago. He's done that since then. He attended the inauguration on January 20th and said that from that time forward, he would stop criticizing this president for immigration policies and anything else, basically establishing a close relationship with this president in the wake and even prior to his swearing in as our president. Well, what had happened even before that time? We recall well that a federal investigation, animated, preceded by an awful lot of preparation by the FBI, but executed, if you will, by the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Southern District of New York. That's basically Manhattan. That's the location of the Department of Justice there, prosecutors in all sorts of areas, including public corruption right there in Manhattan. The office's investigation, again, along with the FBI, into the mayor began actually in the middle of 2021. And the conduct described in the indictment that eventually came out from a grand jury, once again, 23 people brought together there in Manhattan to decide whether there's probable cause to believe that a crime had been committed. The indictment that ultimately was issued by a grand jury followed that investigation of the FBI, of the United States Attorney's Office, reaches back, interestingly, to a time when Adams was serving as the borough president for Brooklyn there prior to his time as the mayor, but also focused upon things related to his conduct as the mayor there in New York. In particular, the grand jury in that indictment, a federal indictment pending in federal court until late this past week, accused the mayor of accepting more than $100,000 in flight upgrades and some airline tickets. Also accused him of pressuring the New York Fire Department to speed up, to move forward more quickly, its approval of a new Turkish consulate. That was a key aspect of the charges against him. And also receiving some foreign contributions from wealthy foreigners who are not legally permitted under our federal laws from making campaign contributions to his campaign for the mayor. And by soliciting those illegal donations, according to the indictment, Adams fraudulently obtained millions of dollars in public matching funds for his campaign. All of that set forth by the prosecutors, by the grand jury. The mayor pleaded not guilty. We always hasten to add on this broadcast and others that any defendant, prior to the return of a verdict by a trial jury, a petit jury, is assumed innocent. Under our system of laws. And just weeks ago, prosecutors had said that they had uncovered some additional criminal conduct by Adams involving some obstruction of justice. We'll get back to that. Note that right now. But that's where things were. And obviously the case moving toward trial fairly soon, a little bit later, in a couple of months here in this calendar year. Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, going on trial there in a federal court in the Southern District of New York in Manhattan for these charges returned by the grand jury. And again, that's when we got this reporting coming out of some sources in Washington, D.C., that maybe, just maybe, there was some tendrils, some outreach by the Department of Justice. We don't know if it was from the U.S. Attorney's Office or Maine Justice at the time. Clear now it was from Maine Justice, inquiring about whether there could be a resolution somehow of this case, maybe dropping the case entirely against Eric Adams. We commented at that time about the impropriety of that, and that somehow this might be a quid pro quo. Again, words that are used even in recent days to describe what did in fact happen here. Not only in the wake of the mayor's currying this favor, these increased relationships, committing to stop criticizing the president for immigration policies, even supporting the president when it comes to meeting with the border czar. Very recently, we know as well that Eric Adams had opened Rikers to ICE agents, announcing that he would issue an executive order to allow federal immigration authorities into the Rikers Island jail complex. That was a significant, major shift in the city's sanctuary policies for immigration issues. The mayor said he would also move to allow the Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents into the jail to assist in those criminal investigations, in particular, those focused on violent criminals and gangs. That's what the mayor had also said as a part of his increasing relationship with the president, and in particular with the president's border czar. You may recall his name, Thomas Homan, Homan. All of that also seen on television recently as a result of this warming up of the relationship between the mayor and the president, specifically on immigration issues, but suggesting along the way that all of this was heading toward another result. And sure enough, what just happened this past week is this. Emile Beauvais, again, he's serving in an acting capacity right now. Eventually, for what it's worth, he is going to be something called the Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General. He's going to be second in command, kind of operating behind the scenes for a fellow named Todd Blanche, whose name you've also seen. You've also seen him as well. Both Blanche and Beauvais, you may recall their images, you may recall their voices, things coming out of that Manhattan courtroom room a number of weeks and, frankly, most of last year, having to do with the charges against the now president, 34 counts of violations of New York law for having engaged in fraud, connection with those silent or not so silent payments to Stormy Daniels to keep her quiet about the affair in advance of the 2016 election. That's a lot, I know. That prosecution, which Emile Beauvais and Todd Blanche represented when they were in private practice, represented the now president, formerly at that time a private citizen. They represented him in that case, and so you may recall seeing him sitting at counsel table near Blanche, near the president, right between the two of them. Emile Beauvais, since that time, becoming this important person inside the Department of Justice. And yes, just this past week, in the wake of all of that, apparently in the wake of lots of communications with Eric Adams, directing the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. This is the big news story of this past week, telling her she's got to dismiss this case and get rid of it. We decided to get rid of the case, making the request to do that without prejudice. We'll talk more about what that means, and we'll talk about the consequences of what Emile Beauvais, right now the acting Deputy Attorney General, what are the consequences of that? Some major things going on inside the department in Manhattan, at Main Justice, all of those affecting the rule of law in America, all of that coming up here on Amicus, a Law Review. producer Max. We are taking your phone calls, your inquiries, your questions, as always, here on our weekend broadcast. That number is 855-752-4842, 855-752-4842. Max will be administering those phone calls as they come in. Be a part of our discussion this weekend about this major story coming out of Maine Justice, coming out of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan, coming out of the Justice Department generally across our nation, affecting everyone, not just the mayor, not just people of Manhattan, not just those folks who spend a lot of their time inside those government offices in Manhattan and in Washington, D.C., but I'd argue you as well, because of the civics lessons, the lessons about what the Department of Justice should and should not be doing in any administration, including this one. Brought you up to speed in terms of the background until just this past week. Eric Adams, the mayor, again charged by this grand jury indictment of major fraud, presumed innocent until he's proven guilty, if at all, heading to trial fairly soon, and along the way engaging in an awful lot of relationships with the current president, visiting him at Mar-a-Lago, being a part of the inauguration, having some discussions, obviously, with the present czar, the immigration czar, about ways in which the mayor can further facilitate the policies of New York City, which is a sanctuary city when it comes to immigration issues. All of that prompting an awful lot of skepticism. The skepticism comes true this past week when the acting deputy attorney general, again, his name is Emile Beauvais, a name you should remember, should know about. He's going to be a major player for the next 4 years inside the Department of Justice, even as eventually he assumes his permanent role as the principal associate deputy attorney general under Todd Blanche. That's a lot of inside baseball. But the reality is that right now he's calling a lot of the shots inside Maine Justice, and he directs the United States attorney for the Southern District of New York to dismiss the case, dismiss the criminal prosecution against Eric Adams. He does that just this past week. He says along the way that his decision to do this is because the mayor's indictment has limited Adams' ability to cooperate in President Trump's immigration crackdown. Again, that should be your first concern there, that somehow the policies related to immigration are being impacted by the pendency of a criminal investigation and a criminal prosecution unrelated to that. Beauvais also suggested the indictment, which was handed down way back in September, threatened to interfere, get this, with the June 2025 mayoral primary coming up in just a few months here. Despite the 9-month interval between those two events, the decision again to go ahead and seek the dismissal, telling his underlings, including the U.S. attorney there in Manhattan, to dismiss this case. The allegation, of course, that not that there was not a basis for going ahead with the prosecution, just the opposite. The statements by Emile Beauvais at the time that he directed the dismissal of this case affirmed the legitimacy of the prosecution, said the case was strong. There was no reason to believe that it was not valid or that somehow the grand jury had gone away. Beauvais explicitly saying the Justice Department made its decision without assessing the strength of the evidence, which was considerable, or the legal theories undergirding the case. None of that suspect, but instead criticizing the U.S. attorney who brought the case under the Biden administration, and also Joe Biden himself, expressly indicating this was all politically motivated, and it was because somehow maybe the mayor was not cooperating with the administration. An awful lot of political things that, again, have no place inside the decision to prosecute or not prosecute, to go ahead or not go ahead with a criminal prosecution for soliciting illegal foreign campaign contributions, conspiracy, wire fraud, bribery, all those other things for which there is substantial evidence to try. All of that happens, and indeed then the directive, the letter from Emile Beauvais arrives on the desk of the United States Attorney. She is in an acting capacity. What happens, of course, during these periods of time before a formal nomination of a so-called permanent U.S. Attorney is made, it's not unusual for the administration to put in place an interim or acting United States attorney. I served in that capacity for 1 year between administrations a number of years ago, and her name is Danielle Sassoon, Sassoon. She's the acting, but actually the United States attorney. Don't even have to say acting. She's got all of the responsibilities of that role, and she receives this letter telling her from Emile Beauvais, her boss, the Deputy Attorney General, the acting Deputy Attorney General, telling her that in the case of United States versus Eric Adams, the case number is 24 CR 556. That's the official docket number by the court. You've got to dismiss that case. Dismiss that case. But, oh, by the way, you can do that without prejudice. We'll talk about the reason why that is so significant and why that language actually is prompting people to raise even more concerns about the present status of the mayor there and calling upon him to resign. Plainly, those calls already out there based upon the indictment pending. But now this even heightening concerns about whether or not he can be true and honest in serving the people of New York when a lawsuit is going to be dismissed, but not with prejudice. The possibility of it bringing back under a new set of circumstances. We'll talk more about that in just a few moments. The letter from Emile Beauvais lands on Danielle Sassoon's desk, and she looks at it, and she plainly has consultations internal to her own office with the people who are surrounding her, including her criminal division chief, people from the public integrity section, inside the office there, and probably inside the public integrity section of Main Justice as well. They're located in Washington, D.C. Also very usual for a U.S. Attorney's Office, even the Southern District of New York, which has this great deal of autonomy, has this reputation for being almost its own Department of Justice, also connected very much back to the Public Integrity Section, a unit of Main Justice where there are attorneys who work on these kinds of public corruption cases, plainly supported, worked on the investigation, worked on the prosecution itself. She reaches out and she says, I've got this directive from my boss to dismiss this case after all of this investigation, after all of this pretrial work. What should we do? Maybe she doesn't even have to ask the question. She decides fairly early on she can't do this. And so what does she do? She writes an eight-page letter to Emile Beauvais. And it is on the U.S. Department of Justice letterhead. It's coming from the Jacob Javits Federal Building, which is where the U.S. Attorney's Office is, at 26 Federal Plaza, the 37th floor right there in New York. She writes back and she says no. She says to him, I have received this letter, and I've decided not to go ahead and dismiss this case. In particular, she writes back not to Emile Beauvais. She writes back to her boss. She writes back to the Attorney General, Pamela Bondi, the Attorney General of the United States, and she says on February 10th, I received this memorandum from Deputy Attorney General Emile Beauvais directing me to dismiss the indictment against Eric Adams without prejudice, keep that in mind, subject to certain conditions which would require leave of court. Keep that in mind as well when we talk about what the judge here is now obliged to do. She says, I don't repeat here the evidence against Adams that proves beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed federal crimes. That's her way of saying the second sentence of this letter that, hey, there's no reason to believe that this cannot result in a criminal conviction of him beyond a reasonable doubt. This case is strong. Mr. Beauvais rightly has never called into question, she says, that the case team conducted this investigation with integrity, nothing about the way this was conducted, nor has he said that the charges against Adams are anything other than serious and supported by the facts and the law. Mr. Beauvais' directive to me, she says, directing me to dismiss this indictment based on a duly constituted act of the grand jury, has nothing to do with the strength of the case. It raises concerns, she says, that render the contemplated dismissal inconsistent, she says, with my ability and duty to prosecute federal crimes without fear or favor and to advance good faith arguments before the courts. That's really her first paragraph, goes on for 8 pages. I'd like to provide you with some specific information, some specific recitations about some of the key things she says in the following paragraphs in that letter. It is a very important piece of legal writing. It's a very important piece now in the history of our nation because not only does it set forth, as I've said, these basic standards by which the Department of Justice is obliged to work, but also reestablishes, again, the principled decision by good people of all parties inside the Department of Justice. We shouldn't care. We don't care what your partisan views are privately. They're not animated by that. And she affirms that basically in this letter, both implicitly and explicitly, in saying politics should have nothing to do with this. My politics have nothing to do with this, she says. What is animating all of us is the law and the facts of this case. She says the reasons advanced by Mr. Beauvais for dismissing the indictment are not ones I can good faith, she says, Madam Attorney General, defend as in the public interest and as consistent with the principles of impartiality and fairness that guide my decision making. Those are strong words coming from a United States attorney tutoring the Attorney General about how we're supposed to conduct ourselves. She says the legal judgments of the Department of Justice must be impartial, insulated from political influence. She cites some specific policies of this administration. She says, but Adams has argued in substance, and Mr. Beauvais appears prepared to concede that Adams, the mayor, should receive leniency for federal crimes solely because, and here we go, because he occupies an important public position and can use that position to assist in the administration's policy priorities, completely inconsistent with the way these things should play out. She goes on to say, it is unclear why Adams would be better able to aid in immigration enforcement when the threat of future conviction is due to the possibility of reinstatement of the indictment followed by conviction at trial, rather than merely the possibility of conviction at trial. On this point, the possibility of trial before or after the election cannot be relevant. She's talking about the timing there, because Adams has selected the timing of his trial. Now, what does all that mean? How do we unpack that? Well, once again, the directive from Emile Beauvais, curiously, interestingly, but again, consistent with this notion that we're going to have this hanging over the mayor and keep him in line when it comes to following the immigration policies and other law enforcement policies of this administration, is I'm directing you, he says to the U.S. Attorney, to dismiss this without prejudice. What does that mean? And what is it that U.S. Attorney Sassoon is describing there? She's saying, well, we'll go in then, according to you, Mr. Beauvais, dismiss this case for now. But if down the road circumstances change, the facts won't change, the strength of the case won't change. But if something else changes, we can bring this case back and we can reinitiate that because it's without prejudice. The prejudice would be, if it was with prejudice, it would be dismissed for all time. And we've seen some cases where that has happened, both in Democratic and Republican administrations, apolitically. Here, we want to dismiss this case so we can keep it hanging over the head of the mayor. And presumably the notion, as implicitly and explicitly said by the immigration czar on television just this past week, if he doesn't follow through on what he has said, doesn't comply with the terms and conditions, the policy directives on immigration and other things coming out of the White House, you know what? The threat with a capital T is still out there. We can reinitiate that, and along the way, that's going to keep you in line, Mr. Mayor. That's what the Department of Justice is saying to him. That's effectively what the Department of Justice, Emile Beauvais, second in command right now of the Department of Justice, is telling a United States attorney about the reason why she has got to dismiss this case. And she says no. That's exactly what I just read from the letter. She says that's an improper reason for doing this. She talks beyond that about a strange sort of sideshow in all this, and that is a so-called about prisoner exchange, quid pro quo, quid pro quo. She also says that equally insignificant here. She says it's difficult to imagine the department wishes to emulate an episode of the past involving a prisoner exchange by granting Adams leverage over it, akin to Russia's influence in international affairs. Again, talking about prisoner exchanges here, which again, a sideshow, but nonetheless, once again, underscoring the inappropriate international policies that somehow are directing what the Department of Justice does. As we continue here, we'll talk more about that curious quid pro quo, and then also talk about a significant footnote in this letter that the U.S. Attorney drops that tells us a whole lot more about what's going on at Main Justice these days, discussed here on Amicus, a law review. is Jim Santelle. This is Amicus, a law review. We're here on the broadcast stations of Civic Media, talking all about the response by the United States Attorney, Southern District of New York, to Emile Beauvais, directing her to dismiss this indictment against the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, in language that could not be more clear. She says that with respect to the invocation by the Deputy Attorney General of a prisoner exchange involving a fellow named Bout, completely inaccurate, completely misleading, and she says it's particularly alarming, inappropriate to suggest that somehow the international decisions about a prisoner exchange should somehow animate what we're doing here in the criminal justice system. She criticizes him for even raising that and describes it as a quid pro quo, and she says that's exactly what's going on right now. And that also a part of her letter. Interestingly, she drops a footnote on page 3. She says, I attended a meeting on January 31st with Mr. Beauvais, Adams' counsel, that is his defense counsel, also rightly there, and members of my own office. She said, Adams' attorneys repeatedly urged what amounted to a quid pro quo, the very thing that Beauvais said was a part of this prisoner exchange, and to which the U.S. attorney had taken great exception. She said he repeatedly made reference to that, indicating that Adams would be in a position to assist with the department's enforcement priorities only if the indictment was dismissed. Mr. Beauvais admonished a member of my team. She's talking about assistant U.S. attorneys, leaders in the U.S. attorney's office there in Manhattan. Beauvais admonished a member of my team who took notes during that meeting and directed the collection of those notes at the meeting's conclusion. Taking notes, gosh, there's an interesting idea for lawyers. We all take notes. Everyone takes notes, right? To memorialize what happens in meetings, especially meetings of this kind. Emile Beauvais did not want any sort of written recording of what happened. Well, the U.S. attorney basically does just that. She memorializes what happens at that meeting, this quid pro quo, and also suggests along the way that Emile Beauvais' actions, collecting the notes, somehow wanting to, keep or even destroy evidence of what he's proposing here, that's the conduct of a deputy attorney general. She also goes on to attack this allegation that somehow the timing of this is inappropriate. We've got the mayoral election, the process going ahead soon here, indicted way back in 2024. She said the timing of the charges in this case is also consistent with charging timelines of other cases involving elected officials, both in this district and other places. She says, I am not aware of any instance in which the department has concluded that no indictment brought this far in advance of an election is improper because it may be pending during an electoral cycle, let alone that a validly returned and factually supported indictment, there is that theme once again, should be dismissed on that basis. Timing, she says, has no relevance whatsoever. She talks about weaponization, something that the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, has also talked about recently in creating an anti-weaponization task force inside the Department of Justice. He goes on to say this, confidence in the department, this is the U.S. Attorney, would be best restored by means well short of dismissal. As you know, our office is prepared to seek a superseding indictment from a new grand jury under my leadership. We have proposed a superseding indictment, a new set of charges that would add an obstruction conspiracy count based on evidence that Adams destroyed and instructed others to destroy evidence and provide false information to the FBI, and that would further factual allegations regarding his participation in a fraudulent straw donor scheme. All of that as a part of a larger discussion about this idea that somehow this is political in motivation, that there's even more evidence that Eric Adams has engaged in further criminal conduct, that this is not only not weaponization of the Department of Justice by the prior U.S. attorney, by this U.S. attorney, by the FBI. This is just the opposite. And she drops this bombshell. It's a big deal that there were even more charges coming, an additional new indictment charging him with even more. None of that now going to see the light of day. She goes on to say that the seeking leave of court here to dismiss a properly returned indictment based on Emile Beauvais' stated rationales, that is, this quid pro quo for participation in immigration policies, is also likely to backfire. By inviting skepticism and scrutiny, as well it should, from the court that will ultimately hinder the Department of Justice interests. In particular, the U.S. Attorney says, the court is unlikely to acquiesce in using the criminal process to control the behavior of a political figure. Wow. Wow, strong words. What's going on there? Well, again, we know that there's a judge. His name is Dale E. Ho. He was the trial judge before whom this case was going to be tried. He's handling all the pretrial matters, scheduling things on, anticipating the trial of this defendant, maybe even with those superseding obstruction charges being added on, which, again, we're not going to see the light of day. But Dale E. Ho is his name. He's the federal district court judge, and he is the one presiding over this case. He is the one who now effectively, because of things that I'll tell you about in just a moment or so, he is the one who's now got to decide whether to grant this request of the United States Department of Justice to dismiss the case, to dismiss it, again, without prejudice, to dismiss it in such a way that it could come back at some point down the road if the Deputy Attorney General, if a new U.S. Attorney, someone in the public integrity section, if the president decides that the charges should be reinitiated. The judge right now, Dale E. Ho, has before him the question of whether or not he should grant what's called leave of court. And yes, indeed, that's what United States Attorney Sassoon is talking about. He has got not a huge amount of responsibility, but some authority and some responsibility to decide whether or not this is in the interests of justice. He doesn't have to do it. And indeed, there have been some instances where judges have said no. Most often the appellate courts in our country, including right here in the Seventh Circuit, D.C., others have said, you've got very little authority here. If the parties want to dismiss a case, if the government feels it's in the interests of justice to dismiss it, you probably should go ahead and do it. But still, there is some oversight responsibility here. And now Judge Ho is going to be determining whether or not, in the wake of all of this, he should indeed grant leave of court to do it. Anticipate hearings coming up for all of that. And so that leads then receding back into the history of this. What happens? Well, not only does the U.S. Attorney issue this letter, not only does she say that all of this is happening, she says, I'm baffled by the rushed and superficial process by which this decision was reached. Because of that, I'm asking to meet with you, Madam Attorney General. If you don't want to do that, I'm prepared to tender my resignation over this. It's that important, she says. And indeed, Emile Beauvais writes back and says the resignation is accepted. In our second hour, we'll talk about what happened in the wake of that resignation, in the wake of what Emile Beauvais has done, what's coming up for Judge Ho, what's coming up for the Justice Department and America here on Amicus, a law review.
Welcome to Amicus, a law review with Jim Santelle, Civic Media's weekly review and discussion of some of the most significant news stories in the areas of law, government, courts, and the aspiration for justice. And now, here's your host, Jim Santelle.
This is Amicus, a law review, and my name is Jim Santelle, your host for this, the second hour of our weekend broadcast, focusing on all things justice in our broadcast this weekend, specifically this major story coming out of Washington, D.C. involving the dismissal. And yes, it did indeed happen in the end. I'll tell you about that in just a moment or so. Of the major indictment that has been pending for months against the mayor of New York City, alleging fraud and corruption, all sorts of violations of federal law in connection with his service as mayor, and even before that, when he was a borough president there in New York City. In the wake of the directive from the present Deputy Attorney General of the United States of America to the United States Attorney in Southern District of New York, that U.S. attorney said, no, I'm not doing this, writes an 8-page scathing missive to her boss back at Main Justice saying, I'm not doing this. And by the way, you're violating the basic rules and principles and procedures by which the Department of Justice and any prosecutors should behave when it comes to prosecuting, investigating cases. You're not doing that. She cites the specific things that Pam Bondi and others have said to establish the ways in which the Department of Justice should be apolitical. She notes along the way that Emile Beauvais has not criticized in any way the manner by which the indictment was gotten, affirms that this is a strong case. It should go to trial, anticipating it would go to trial in front of the judge. His name again is Dale E. Ho, and says in the end that your reasons for dismissing the case are completely wrong, completely inappropriate, and unethical. And she goes on to say that because the law does not support a dismissal, and because I'm confident that Mayor Adams has committed the crimes with which he is charged, I cannot agree to seek a dismissal driven by improper consideration. She's talking to, plainly, not only the Attorney General, but Emile Beauvais. As Justice Robert Jackson of the Supreme Court said, she invokes again the statements by him in his writing called The Federal Prosecutor. She said, the prosecutor at his best is one of the most beneficial forces in our society. When he acts from malice or other motives, he is one of the worst. This authority, she says, is granted by people who really wanted the right thing done, wanted crime eliminated. That animation has been granted by the people of the United States of America pursuant to our traditions. She's invoking history. She's invoking, again, the basic standards by which the Department of Justice has operated for all of its history. She goes on to say, I understand that Mr. Beauvais disagrees, and I am mindful of your recent order reiterating prosecutors' duty to make good faith arguments in support of the executive branch's position. And yes, indeed, one of the things we'll talk about are the many policies that the new Attorney General has put in place, indeed advocating for and requiring that U.S. attorneys, assistant U.S. attorneys, stand up in court and advocate for the policies of the White House. Again, a break from past administrations of all varieties. But she goes on to say, but because I do not see any good faith basis for the proposed position, I cannot make such arguments consistent with my duty of candor. She invokes again New York law. And she goes on to say that in particular rationale given by Emile Beauvais, an exchange between a criminal defendant and the Department of Justice, akin once again to this prisoner exchange, to the bout exchange with Russia, is, as explained above in the previous 7 pages, a bargain that a prosecutor should not make. The U.S. Attorney goes on to say, moreover, dismissing without prejudice and with the express option of again indicting Adams in the future creates obvious ethical problems. By implicitly threatening future prosecution, if Adams' cooperation with enforcing the immigration laws proves unsatisfactory to the department. That's the quid pro quo. That's the thing that the immigration czar is holding over the head of the mayor of New York. If you don't cooperate with us, we can come back and reinitiate this case. That's what the U.S. attorney speaks about in terms of the specter of very bad things happening. That's also the reason, of course, why an awful lot of people are now saying that by virtue of what is happening here, Mayor Adams can no longer be a true and honest and genuine representative of the people of New York. Why? Because now he is beholden to Donald Trump, the White House, and the policies of the White House. Again, putting aside the merits or demerits of those, it is a connection, an attempt to be a marionette, if you will, a puppeteer, if you will, while all of this is going on. And it prompts, in the end, the United States Attorney to say not only is she baffled by this decision, but she notes that Emile Beauvais admonished me, she's speaking about herself, to be mindful of my obligations to zealously defend the interests of the United States and to advance good faith arguments on behalf of this administration. Again, she's articulating that with a bit of her tongue in her cheek, because that's not been the proposal. That's not been the mandate of U.S. attorneys. We do things in court on behalf of the people of the United States of America, not on behalf of the administration. Those things may or may not be synonymous, but the focus should always be on justice on behalf of the people of the nation. The U.S. attorney concludes her letter by saying, I hope you share my view that soliciting and considering the concerns of the U.S. attorney overseeing the case serves rather than hinders that goal, and that we can find time to meet. In the event you are unwilling to meet or to reconsider the directive in light of the problems raised by this memorandum from the Deputy Attorney General, I am prepared to offer my resignation. It has been, she says, and continues to be my honor to serve as a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. Danielle Sassoon, United States Attorney. And she was that until Emile Beauvais receiving this letter, this scathing letter from the U.S. attorney telling him that he's wrong, that he's acting unethically, contrary to what the attorney general has said about what U.S. attorneys should be doing, contrary to our basic ways of thinking about prosecution in America. Emile Beauvais decides to fire back, and he fires back with an 8-page letter. And he says to Ms. Sassoon, in no valid sense, do you uphold the Constitution by disobeying direct orders? How dare you disobey what I'm directing you to do? Implementing the policy of a duly elected president. That's your obligation, he tells her, to implement the policies of the White House. And anyone romanticizing that behavior, he says to her, does a disservice to the nature of this work and the public's perception of our efforts. He wrote that he has now accepted her resignation. No need to meet, no need to come to Washington, D.C. It's all done. You can leave, he says, based on your choice to continue pursuing a politically motivated prosecution despite an express instruction to dismiss this case. He goes on to say, you lost sight of the oath that you took when you started at the Department of Justice. That's a battle. That's a war going on between the Deputy Attorney General and one of the chief federal law enforcement officers, and she resigns in the wake of that. And now the problem not only is the dismissal of this lawsuit, what happens next, but you've got people who likewise, based upon this principal assertion of ethics and concerns about what's going on here, not only does Ms. Sassoon decide not to go ahead with her continued involvement, she resigns out of principle. But several hours later, 3 other lawyers also are resigning, and they're a part of what's called the public integrity section of Main Justice. Because what happens, of course, is that now Emile Beauvais, if he can't get the signature of the U.S. attorney who is uncooperative with him, he says, I've got to find somebody else who will sign and file this pleading. And so he comes back to Main Justice. He says, send the case back here. I'm going to go right down the hallway to the public integrity section, and I'm going to tell them, as he did by all reports late this past week, I'm going to tell them that they are now obliged to sign the paper, sign the motion, sign the request to Judge Ho to dismiss this case without prejudice. Do it, he says, and he leaves the room. And there's discussion among the leadership of the public integrity section about what to do here. Apparently, according to an awful lot of reports, a discussion about whether to resign en masse, just as the U.S. attorney has done, or whether there is some other remedy here. And in the wake of that, again, a number of resignations do indeed happen. The officials who oversaw that public integrity section, named Kevin Driscoll, John Keller, those resignations go forward, in addition to the U.S. attorney's resignation. Altogether, when this is all done, In addition to another assistant U.S. attorney back in Manhattan, 7 assistant United States attorneys and U.S. attorneys and public integrity trial attorneys resign as a result of this. What happens in the end, and here's the procedure that ultimately gets this to Judge Ho. Frustrated as he is, Emile Beauvais, he's got to get somebody to sign off on this to get this to the judge. Finally, a person named Ed Sullivan. He is a long-standing, great integrity inside the public integrity section. He is planning probably to retire sometime soon. And he says rather than the entire public integrity section, the entire group of us, rather than all of us resigning en masse and basically shutting this down, let's keep some vestige of public integrity here inside the Department of Justice. He says, I'll do it. I'll fix my name to this, not because he supports this, but this is also an act, frankly, of small heroism here. He does this because he wants public integrity inside the Department of Justice to remain. He signs off on it, along with the acting head of the criminal division. And interestingly, Emile Beauvais himself also signs off on this. It's not a long pleading. There are an awful lot of representations in this petition to Judge Ho that is then filed late this past week in the district court there in the District of Columbia, all about what Emile Beauvais wants to have done. Not what the interests of justice command, not what the rules command, but Emile Beauvais, what the Deputy Attorney General wants to have happen here. That's the premise upon which the pleading is written. And so that gets filed. And that brings us up to date, because now it means that on the docket of this case, in addition to an awful lot of attorneys previously involved in this case from the public integrity section, including an additional assistant U.S. attorney named Hagan Scotton. You may have heard about this as well. He writes a note also to Emile Beauvais and to the Attorney General. He says, maybe you're going to find a fool, maybe you're going to find a coward to do this, but it's not going to be me. Strong words from an assistant U.S. attorney to a deputy attorney general to an attorney general about finding somebody, either a fool or a coward to do this, but it's not going to be me. Altogether, 7 people. Various offices of the Department of Justice have said, nope, cannot do this ethically, and for that reason, I'm going to resign. And that gets us then to the next step by Judge Ho, which we'll talk about more right after this and as Amicus, a law review, continues. This is Amicus, a law review. My name is Jim Santelle, inviting you again to be a part of our discussion this weekend at 855-752-4842, joined by my terrific producer, Max. Together, we're inviting your questions and comments, observations, inquiries about the subject matters on our syllabus, principally this major issue involving our United States Department of Justice and the fight. Not just a skirmish, it's an all-out battle between prosecutors, who are the line prosecutors doing the work in the federal courts in America, and the new leadership at the Department of Justice, including Emile Beauvais, a name you should get familiar with. And also, of course, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General. We'll talk more about what she has done also in recent days. She has got a headache on her hands here, to mix metaphors a bit. She has got a major problem here when it comes now to the future of not only the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan, but also her own Justice Department there and around the country. She has, as some people say, some explaining to do more immediately, probably. Judge Ho, before whom this matter is now pending, he's now got a decision to make. Does he dismiss this case without prejudice? Does he do other things? And does he have the ability, the answer is yes, to conduct a hearing on this to try to determine whether or not leave of court should indeed be granted? Is it in the interest of justice to get rid of this case upon this petition, knowing that the facts of this are not premised upon a decision that the law is no longer there, that the underlying allegations are no longer true, but premised upon this notion that it will assist the mayor in these political events and political support of his for immigration policies there in New York? All of that on the possible desk of Judge Ho. He could schedule sometime, maybe as soon as next week, a public hearing. Federal courts are open to the public. A public hearing where he asks the parties, what's going on here? Tell me why it is I should or should not affix my name to this order, dismissing this case without prejudice. In the end, probably because of the limited authority and discretion that judges have when it comes to doing these kinds of things, if all the parties agree to it. We've seen this before in other cases. Probably Judge Ho will sign the order and the case will go away, at least for now. But he will also ask about this without prejudice business. He'll ask about what the plans are to reinitiate, why it is it needs to be dismissed now, but subject to the future resurrection down the road. He'll ask about all of that, and we'll see what he does. That will animate a lot of the news, the rule of law news in the coming week alone. In the meantime, a couple of footnotes about all of this. Obviously, Department of Justice diminished this weekend as these terrific, apolitical, nonpartisan, not Republicans, not Democrats, prosecutors are no longer there. The public integrity section, also one of the core units of the Department of Justice, when the leadership of it and major players inside that unit are no longer there, we are all diminished. Now, those places can be refurbished, they can be filled again by others, but you lose an awful lot of experience and insight and perspective and just basically capacity. The U.S. Attorney herself, she's an interim U.S. Attorney, has a lot of experience there. The Assistant U.S. Attorney, who also wrote this poison pen letter to the Attorney General about finding a fool or a coward. Also, any loss like this is significant. And so while the Trump administration, yes, indeed, it is the Trump administration that plainly is calling these shots, again, inappropriately, while Pam Bondi and U.S. attorneys can fill these spots, we are diminished even in the departure of those attorneys. I would offer that no less significantly, we're diminished in the plain abrogation of this long-standing non-relationship between the White House and the Department of Justice. One of the things that we'll talk about in connection with the changes made recently by this Attorney General and by the White House are the fact that the Trump administration has issued an order, again, among many other things related to its relationship with the Department of Justice. It largely reflects some of the guidance given during the first term of Donald Trump, but there are some more clearly identified ways in which communications can indeed happen. And the upshot of this new policy is that indeed the president and others in the White House can talk about specific cases. Significant that in the post-Watergate era, as we've talked about at great length on this broadcast, the White House and the Justice Department have tried to maintain this very strong arm's length relationship, clearer lines of separation to do what? To prevent the president and his aides from influencing sensitive cases, frankly, any cases. They can make decisions about policy, generally emphasis on tax or antitrust or environment, all kinds of things out there, but should not be influencing specific cases. Well, the White House counsel has now made clear that the president, vice president, and their counsels may ask and may engage in communications about specific criminal and civil investigations. Highly likely that happened here. And this is one of the eroding of those guardrails we've talked about a lot. Now, Donald Trump, when asked about this very recently, has said, I know nothing about this case. I know nothing about how this is going forward. That's his statement to America. That's his statement to his own staff and to the Department of Justice generally. It is appropriate to wonder whether that is accurate or simply a way of shielding himself from the kind of political firestorm that is coming in the wake of all of this. Undeniably, an eroding of guidelines and of guardrails when it comes to communications. Here, you've got a White House telling the Department of Justice to dismiss this case. Why? Because of political reasons, immigration reasons in particular. We also want to keep the mayor of New York under our thumb. And that's the other big takeaway from this going forward. An awful lot of calls now, as I said before, for the mayor to resign. You might think, well, gee, he's been under indictment for a while. Why didn't those calls come? They did before. But now you've got this special overlay that even as the case may next week and the weeks ahead be dismissed, it's still hanging over Eric Adams because it's dismissed without prejudice. And if indeed, as the immigration czar said on Fox News just this past week, if indeed Eric Adams doesn't play along with this administration, the czar will be back, he said, in Eric Adams' office to say what's going on here, and implicitly suggested that the prosecution will be resurrected and revived in such a way that Eric Adams will once again be under criminal prosecution. That's exactly the kind of thing that the people of New York State, the United States of America should not have when it comes to our public servants. All of this, a degradation of the standards and practices of the Department of Justice, all of this happening in the first days of the Bondi administration, an awful lot of things to look to when it comes to how and why Emile Beauvais himself, a former assistant U.S. attorney, someone who was at the time of the January 6th events was outraged by what was happening, the insurrectionists, has plainly now become inside the Department of Justice a political actor who is doing exactly what the White House wants him to do, but not without the attention of other people, non-political, apolitical, nonpartisan people in the Department of Justice who are leaving the department rather than to continue to serve in an agency and administration that plainly has given up, at least in this respect, when it comes to the integrity of decisions to prosecute, and here, not to prosecute as well. More of that story plainly coming up this coming week, and that will be principally now in the arena, in the courtroom of Judge Ho in the District of Columbia. We'll continue to focus on that, in addition to the impacts of this change in policy coming out of the U.S. Department of Justice and the White House, having to do with arms-length relationships. More about things coming out of the Department of Justice when Amicus, a law review, continues. And Max, I'll probably take Mark fairly early on in this next segment. is Amicus, a law review. My name's Jim Santelle, your host for this, the second hour of our weekend broadcast. As always, inviting you to be a part of our discussion. We're going to get to at least one caller in just a moment or so. I want to talk again about things coming out of the Department of Justice, not only this major bombshell, this fight between the now former U.S. Attorney in Manhattan and the acting Deputy Attorney General, going to describe in many ways and define in many ways the Department of Justice going forward. It's a headache, as I said, for Pam Bondi. It is a challenge that she needs now to face when it comes to the future of her own administration of justice, not just when it comes to the Manhattan U.S. Attorney's Office, but the 92 other U.S. attorneys who are out there. In that connection, one of the things that recently has happened is that all the U.S. attorneys, again, they're all political appointees, almost all of them, have recently been told by the White House that they need to leave. There was a recent email that was sent to all of them saying that it is now time for you to vacate your offices. These are principally the Biden administration U.S. attorneys, telling that their services are no longer needed. That in and of itself, at the end of every administration, the start of a new one, always causes a lot of commotion. The reality is that sooner or later, all of the political appointees do need to leave the office, and so that there can be new appointees made. And that will proceed, obviously, upon, as I said at the outset, this connection between senators who are responsible for identifying candidates within the various districts around the country, making recommendations to the White House about who should be the U.S. attorney in eastern Wisconsin or western Wisconsin or northern Illinois or any of the other many districts around the country. Just this past week, again, fairly unceremoniously, without coordination of something called the Executive Office for United States Attorneys, which normally facilitates the transfer, the movement away of the previous U.S. attorneys from their posts and into the private sector or other assignments, normally handled through the Department of Justice. This time from the White House, all the U.S. attorneys get a notice saying that their services are no longer needed, that they are being terminated immediately. They should leave immediately, and so the Biden administration, United States attorneys departing. But along the way, of course, that opens up the prospects for and the anticipation of new U.S. attorneys. And the question that has to be asked of all of them is how they feel about this apparent decision by the Department of Justice, by the White House, to break down that long-standing separation between the White House and the Department of Justice. What happens if, as a U.S. attorney, confirmed by the Senate ultimately, in that position to be the chief federal law enforcement officer in your particular district, you get that phone call from the chief of staff of the White House or the vice president or the president saying, I would like you to prosecute or not prosecute this particular case. That, of course, that phone call alone would be contrary to the established principles and processes of every administration, Democrat, Republican, name your president in recent time, name your attorney general of recent times. And always there has been a separation between the White House and the Department of Justice, proved only sometimes in its violation, when indeed that breaking down does in fact happen, and you get outrage because it's contrary to the traditions and standards of the Department of Justice. As U.S. attorneys under this administration, again, the Trump appointees take those positions, questions about what they should anticipate, questions about what they should do if indeed, as happened to the U.S. attorney in Manhattan, they receive one of these phone calls, whether it's from Main Justice or the White House directly, telling them expressly who to prosecute, who not to prosecute, criminal cases, civil cases. That is contrary to, again, decades, if not more, tradition of the Department of Justice. A few of the things coming out of the Department of Justice, again, in the category of rule of law snapshots just recently. Other dismissal of some significance, again, in the wake of what happened with Emile Beauvais and with Eric Adams just this past week, kind of fell under the radar. But federal prosecutors moved to drop the last remaining efforts to prosecute Donald Trump's two co-defendants. Remember these fellows, Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira? These are the guys who were identified as co-conspirators along with Donald Trump in attempting to obstruct justice. These are the guys at Mar-a-Lago who were trying to figure out ways of not producing those documents, of getting rid of the tapes, the recordings of movements of those documents. They were joined as co-defendants in that indictment. That indictment, you recall well, was dismissed by a federal district court judge. Her name, Eileen Cannon. The whole thing was pending in front of the 11th Circuit. Again, the Department of Justice dismissed Donald Trump from that case, but did not dismiss the other two by the end of the administration. Well, now the Department of Justice has dismissed those others, single-page filing. Prosecutors asked the appeals court, the 11th Circuit in Atlanta there, to dismiss the appeal of these two remaining individuals. And again, the court has got to grant authority to do just that. It's going to drop the government's challenge to the continuing appellate proceedings that are pending there in the 11th Circuit. It would formally end that case, the Mar-a-Lago documents case. The only remaining thing that is out there, of course, with the presumed dismissal soon of the two remaining defendants is the remaining portion of the Jack Smith report. You may recall well that the Department of Justice and the prior Attorney General, Merrick Garland, decided not to release that report. Why? Because these cases were still pending. Now that they're going away, should we anticipate from Pam Bondi the release of that second portion of that report, the separate section of Jack Smith's report concerning how he and others investigated and prosecute that case, accusing not only the defendant in that case of Donald Trump of taking documents should not have, but also of obstruction of justice along with these other two defendants. More homework, if you will, for Pam Bondi, more small headaches, if you will, to try to figure out what she's going to do. Should release the report, but again, it's within your discretion to do that or not. But nonetheless, the decision by the Department of Justice to release those other defendants, now bringing that case to a decisive conclusion. The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, also announcing just this past week that she is filing a lawsuit against the state of New York, the governor there, Kathy Hochul, and the state attorney general, Letitia James. She said, "We're taking steps to protect America. New York has chosen to prioritize illegal aliens over American citizens," our attorney general said. "We sued Illinois," indeed she did recently, "and New York didn't listen, so now you're next." That's what the attorney general said in a statement that was released to the media after that, right after the lawsuit. Letitia James, the attorney general, said, "Our state laws, including the green light law, protects the rights of all New Yorkers and keeps our communities safe. I'm prepared to defend our laws just as I always have." The receipt, the initiation of this lawsuit provides the governor, Kathy Hochul, also provide a statement about this. She says in a separate statement that Bondi's news conference announcing this was smoke and mirrors. That's what the governor says. Because the Justice Department's lawsuit, she said, was a routine civil action about a law passed in 2019 that's been upheld by the courts time and again. The governor goes on to say, "There's no way I'm letting federal agents or Elon Musk's shadowy Doge operation get unfettered access to the personal data of any New Yorker in the DMV system, like 16-year-old kids learning to drive and otherwise vulnerable people. We expect Pam Bondi's," the governor went on to say, "we expect Pam Bondi's worthless publicity-driven lawsuit to be a total failure, just like all the others. Let me be clear, New York is not backing down." Again, that in the wake of the initiation of this lawsuit by Pam Bondi, suing New York, suing the top officials there as well. And we've got yet another story sort of coming out of New York, but also the Department of Justice, but also raising some recollections of the past. Just this past week, Trump ally Steve Bannon, we know that he's a senior advisor, probably informally now, but certainly in the first administration, he pled guilty. He pled guilty to a state charge to a fraud-related crime in basically defrauding donors who may have given him some money, did give him some money, in this effort to build a wall along the U.S. southern border. A case that has drawn a lot of controversy. You may recall this case was originally prosecuted by federal authorities who said that he was in violation of federal law. He ultimately pleaded guilty to a count and was in New York when the federal case was the subject of a pardon by the president, basically eliminating that federal case. Now Steve Bannon has pleaded guilty to the state charge, the same kind of thing, pleading guilty to the scheme to defraud these donors for this build a wall a proposal, this build-a-wall scheme, and he's gotten a 3-year conditional discharge. We've learned an awful lot about New York law recently. He's going to be on probation for 3 years. It's a conditional discharge, basically says he's got to stay out of trouble to avoid additional punishment, no jail time, could be supervised, but not going to jail, and brings that state offense now, that state charge, to resolution in the wake of the unsuccessful criminal prosecution in the federal court, the pardon by Donald Trump, and the subsequent prosecution by him there in the Manhattan DA's office, that prosecution by Alvin Bragg, the DA there in Manhattan. Lots of things coming out of New York, lots of things coming out of Maine Justice, lots of things going on in the prosecution of cases in America these days. Delighted, as always, to have caller Mark. You're on the phone. Thank you for waiting around. We appreciate, as always, your contributions to our discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, Jim. Yeah, and it strikes me that Trump is in violation of one of the principles that we, in our Declaration of Independence, making judges dependent on his will alone. I might not be quoting that precisely, but the king had complete power over the judges back in the day, whether somebody should be charged or not, and it seems like to me that Trump, with his coordination with the Department of Justice now, will be doing that. And the other question I have is that since Eric Adams violated not only federal law, he violated state law under New York's Constitution, because I actually looked it up. New York's Constitution actually does have the emoluments clause in it as well. And could not the state take up prosecution of Eric Adams on those same charges? Because it seems that Adams actually took money from foreign sources, and that's specifically prohibited under New York's Constitution as well as the U.S. Constitution.
All those great points as always, Mark. And again, the great concern again about the exercise of power and authority, right, by our leaders at Maine Justice. Their second point, again, a lot of discussion going on right now about what happens to Eric Adams in the future. As I indicated, an awful lot of people calling for his resignation. Why? Because now he is going to be, presuming this case is dismissed, and I'm making a bit of a presumption here, but not much, that he is going to be under the thumb of the current president, the current administration, and therefore not able to properly serve independently and exercise discretion independent of the Trump administration. Kathy Hochul also suggesting very implicitly, again, the governor of New York, also is suggesting that she's got some authorities to remove him from that office. And your point is also well made, that an awful lot of people pulling out the New York state statutes, the criminal statutes. And again, because this is going on in New York, plainly venue there is appropriate. And the question would be, can you craft charges under New York law that would not be subject plainly to federal prosecution or federal oversight? Can't prosecute those because they're state offenses. Does the DA, does Alvin Bragg initiate some charges here in the wake of the collapse of what appeared to be, according to all sources and all information, public and plainly from the U.S. attorney herself, a very, very strong case where a jury, regardless if it's federal or state, could in fact have found him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Does the state now pick that up? Mark, a terrific point to make. And again, lots of questions in a story that plainly is not going to go away anytime soon. Appreciate your comment and question, Mark. As always, all of our callers at 855-752-4842 being a part of our discussion here on Amicus, a law review. Promised we would continue as well this focus on all things Department of Justice by talking about these other policies and things that the Bondi administration has put in place. We've talked previously about the impact of these decisions, for example, to basically shut down the Civil Rights Division, including no new civil rights cases, no cases involving oversight of our police agencies. We've seen already from our discussion this weekend the impact upon the public integrity section, huge amounts of impacts having to do with our national security issues as well, could weaken our efforts to combat foreign influence. She's dismantling a foreign influence task force, establishing new limitations on protections under the law, all kinds of things going on. We'll talk more about those new policies under the Bondi administration as Amicus Law Review continues. Santelle. In this, the last segment of our show, talking about all things justice, lots of things Justice Department related. A bit of a programming note for next week as well. We're going to take a look at some things happening beyond Washington, D.C. as well. We're going to talk about this federal judge who recently shut down, at least temporarily, the attack upon our transgender youth established by the policies of the Trump administration. We'll tell you more about what happened just this past week at the pen of a federal judge who's pushing back on the attempts by this administration to limit the rights and prerogatives of transgender youth. The judge is named Brendan Hansen. We'll talk more about that next week. We'll also talk about another aspect of Kathy Hochul's recent work, deciding not to honor the directives of a Texas judge who's asking that a particular medical doctor in New York City be extradited back to Texas to face some charges involving telemedicine. Particularly, this is a medical doctor providing abortion pills, privacy rights being advanced there in New York to residents of Texas. And we'll talk about the intersection between state laws, federal laws, and what Kathy Hochul did just this past week to tell the Texas authorities, including the governor, including the judge there, that she is going to continue to enforce the privacy rights of Americans, including those of the state of New York, is not going to surrender up this medical doctor based upon the allegations and the findings of the Texas judges, the judgment entered there. Lots of interesting things coming up next week as well. As we continue to talk about the Department of Justice this week, lots of things to keep in mind about what Pam Bondi has done. Mentioned right before our break that she's done some things in national security area to arguably weaken our foreign influence in U.S. elections. We've talked a lot about the USAID in our previous broadcast. There's more going on in addition to disbanding this foreign influence task force. She's also shutting down a foreign corporation enforcement unit, which also ensures integrity when it comes to the activities of companies and corporations here in the United States of America. The big one, of course, we've seen a lot of is one of the first amendments memorandums that she issued on her first day in office, 14 of them altogether. One of the first of those are planned efforts to investigate and, yes, indeed, undo some of the legal moves from the Biden administration. And that includes the establishment of what she's calling a weaponization working group. According to what she's indicated here, to review law enforcement actions enacted under the Biden administration for any examples of politicized justice. Now, that was actually made reference to by the U.S. attorney in her departure letter. That is, not only is there no weaponization, there is integrity. Here, the irony cannot be overstated that we've got a new weaponization task force, a working group inside the Department of Justice. The review, according to Pam Bondi, will cover cases brought by former special counsel Jack Smith on the handling of the classified documents case, on the 2020 election case. Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, we've talked about him, the things he is doing even now. The hush money case that led to that conviction of Donald Trump, which remains in place, that judgment's still in place. Case from New York, Letitia James, of course, she won that $454 million civil fraud case against Donald Trump. All of that apparently going to be under the review. Curious in terms of the jurisdiction that the federal government has with respect to any or all of these things. But apparently all of that's going to be the focus of some weaponization working group. She's also going to state in another memorandum here that justice officials, including people at the top, assistant U.S. attorneys, cannot substitute their own political beliefs for the arguments of the Trump administration, the White House, as it articulates those. And if they try, she said they'll be subject to disciplinary action or termination. Well, the question about whether that's even needed, of course there should not be the exalting the placement of individual personal views above legitimate law enforcement positions that are argued, as the U.S. attorney herself did, but shouldn't have to tell assistant U.S. attorneys or anybody inside the Department of Justice that politics will not be animating the things that we do. Indeed, during the course of her hearing, she affirmed just that. Nonetheless, there's a new memorandum out arguing and telling the Department of Justice and all of its employees that it cannot do anything even approaching something that would be viewed as political in nature. Interestingly, she has issued 2 memorandums that focus on the elimination of diversity, equity, and inclusion inside the Department of Justice, and indeed in the private sector as well. They stem plainly from the president's own executive orders. You recall these on January 21, the day after he was sworn in, called Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity. Pam Bondi's first memorandum requires all department materials that encouraged or permitted race or sex-based preferences as a method of compliance with federal civil rights laws to be, here it comes, rescinded and replaced by some new guidance, eliminating all that. The second memorandum then directs the Civil Rights Division, such as it is, to investigate and eliminate and penalize illegal DEI preferences, mandates, policies, programs, activities in the private sector and in educational institutions that receive federal funds. In the immigration area, of course, we know that the Attorney General has also directed the Department of Justice to withhold federal funding and pursue enforcement actions against sanctuary cities. Memo cites 8 U.S.C. Section 1373. That's a statute of the federal code that specifically provides that state or local jurisdictions may not prohibit or in any way restrict any government entity or official from sending to or receiving from the Immigration and Naturalization Service information regarding the citizenship or immigration status of any individual. Now, that's what the law says. What she is indicating is we're going to hyper-enforce that and identify in particular sanctuary cities. The memo warning that any sanctuary cities that violate the statute will receive a cut in federal funding that's otherwise appropriate. Lots of things going on there inside the United States Department of Justice. As I've said in other settings, she's also quietly disbanded a Department of Justice task force that was targeting Russian oligarchs and the things that they were doing to violate federal criminal laws in our nation. Consistent with what the White House has done, she's also established a Justice Department task force to eradicate what she has called anti-Christian bias within the federal government, something we've talked about before. That is consistent, again, with the White House's own establishment of some new program, some new office, a faith office as well. Many of the things coming out of the Department of Justice these days will continue with more of the articulation of those new policies of the Department of Justice and this administration as Amicus Law Review continues. Join us next week and down the road for those discussions. Have a good week, everybody.